June 1897, London. The center of the universe. They owned a quarter of the planet. They commanded the oceans. The British pound was not just currency, it was gravity. If you wanted to buy tea in India or beef in Argentina, you paid London. They were the creditor of the world. Now, cut to 1976. The same city. The same buildings. But inside the treasury, men in gray suits are sweating. They are not counting profits. They are filling out a loan application. The British Empire is begging the IMF for a bailout. Just to keep the lights on. How does a nation go from ruling the world to bankruptcy in one lifetime? They didn't lose it on the battlefield. They lost it in the ledger. They made a fatal financial mistake. A mistake worth $35 trillion in today's money. And if you look at the United States today, if you look at the debt piling up in Washington, you realize something terrifying. America isn't just following in Britain's footsteps. It is sprinting towards the same cliff. This is the story of how an empire actually dies. Follow the money. To understand the collapse, you have to understand the trap. Success is dangerous. It makes you lazy. In 1900, Britain was running the world's first truly globalized economy. The engine of this machine was the gold standard. Every pound sterling in existence was backed by physical gold in the Bank of England vaults. This created absolute trust. As good as gold wasn't a metaphor, it was a legal guarantee. But look closer at the books. Even at the height of its power, Britain was living a lie. They were running a trade deficit. They imported more food, more raw materials, and more luxury goods than they exported. Technically, they should have been losing money. So, how did they stay rich? Invisible income. This is key. Britain was the world's banker, the world's insurer, the world's shipper. If a German merchant wanted to sell to a Brazilian farmer, they used a British ship, insured by Lloyd's of London, financed by a British bank. They skimmed a percentage off every transaction on Earth. The cash flowed uphill, straight into the city of London. It seemed like a perpetual motion machine. The elite believed this would last forever. They became complacent. They neglected their own factories. Why build efficient steel mills when you can just lend money to Americans and live off the interest? The British elite made a calculation. They believed that money power was superior to industrial power. They looked at Germany and America building massive factories, and they scoffed. They thought, let them sweat. We will own the debt. But debt is a weapon. And weapons can be turned against you. The system worked only as long as there was peace. Peace is profitable for a banker. War is expensive. And in 1914, the bankers lost control. When World War I began, everyone said it would be over by Christmas. Finance ministers assume short wars. Generals fight long ones. The war didn't last months. It lasted years, and this is where the math breaks. Britain had to feed an army of millions. It had to buy shells, oil, wheat. They couldn't produce enough domestically. So they turned to the United States. At the start of the war, Britain was the boss. America was the employee. Britain owned massive chunks of the American economy. Railways, cattle ranches, skyscrapers, but you can't pay for artillery shells with a share certificate in a railroad. Why you need cash? You need gold, or US dollars. So the Great Liquidation began. The British government forced its own citizens to hand over their foreign investments. Then they sold them. They dumped prime American assets onto the market at fire sale prices. J.P. Morgan sat on the other side of the table, buying up the British Empire's wealth for pennies on the dollar. By 1916, the cash was gone. The gold was draining out of London and flowing into the vaults of New York. Britain moved from being the world's creditor to the world's debtor. They started borrowing from the Americans to fight the Germans. By 1918, they won the war. But they lost the peace. The ledger was destroyed. But here's the arrogance. Instead of downsizing, instead of accepting the new reality, the British elite doubled down. They expanded the empire. They took over the Middle East. They took over German colonies. They increased their overhead costs while their income had collapsed. It is the behavior of a bankrupt aristocrat who refuses to fire the butler. And then, in 1925, they made the single stupidest financial decision in history. Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, put Britain back on the gold standard. But not at a realistic price. He pegged the pound at the pre-war price. $4.86. He wanted to look the dollar in the eye. It was vanity, pure ego. The result? Disaster. British exports became instantly too expensive for the world to buy. Coal mines closed. Steel mills went bust. General strikes paralyzed the country. While America enjoyed the roaring 20s, Britain was in a depression. They strangled their own economy to save the prestige of the currency. They bled themselves dry to maintain an image of strength. And they were still bleeding when Hitler marched into Poland. If World War I was a wound, World War II was an execution. We are taught a romantic version of history. We are told about the special relationship between Britain and America. Brothers in arms. That is a fairy tale. In the world of high finance, there are no friends. There are only liquidity providers. And the United States was ruthless. By 1940, Britain was fighting alone. They were desperate for supplies. Churchill begged Roosevelt for help. Roosevelt smiled, and he pointed to the ledger. The policy was cash and carry. America would sell weapons, but only for hard cash. Britain emptied its gold reserves. They shipped their remaining gold to Canada and then to Fort Knox. When the gold ran out, the Americans demanded assets. Specifically, they targeted British technology, radar, jet engines, antibiotics, nuclear research, the Tizard mission. Britain handed over its most valuable intellectual property to the US, practically for free, in exchange for the ability to borrow money. By 1941, Britain was visibly bankrupt. The US introduced Lend-Lease. It was marketed as charity, lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. But the fine print was brutal. Article 7 of the Lend-Lease Agreement. It demanded the end of the imperial preference system. Basically, it forced Britain to dismantle its own trade empire. It opened up British markets to American corporations. It was a hostile takeover disguised as an alliance. Then came Bretton Woods, 1944. The war wasn't even over. But the US called a conference to design the New World Order. John Maynard Keynes went to New Hampshire to save the British Empire. He proposed a neutral global currency called the bankrupt. He wanted a system where creditor nations, like the US, would be penalized for hoarding money, just as debtors were penalized for owing it. It was a brilliant system to balance the world. The Americans crushed it. Harry Dexter White, the US representative, said no. The new system would be built on the dollar. The dollar would be king. Britain had no leverage. They signed. In that moment, sovereignty ended. The pound became a satellite of the dollar. The empire was now a subsidiary of USA Incorporated. What happens when a superpower runs out of money? It doesn't disappear overnight, it rots. The period from 1945 to 1979 in Britain was a slow, humiliating slide into irrelevance. The government tried to maintain the welfare state at home and the military abroad. But they couldn't afford either. So they printed money. Inflation ripped through the savings of the middle class, the stop-go economy. Every time the economy started to grow, imports would rise, the trade balance would crash, and the government would have to hike interest rates to save the pound. It was like driving a car with the handbrake on. The Suez Crisis in 1956 was the military end. But the financial end was 1976. The winter of discontent was approaching. Inflation was hitting 25%. Think about that. 1/4 of your wealth evaporating every year. The unions went on strike. Trash piled up in Leicester Square. The dead went unburied in Liverpool because gravediggers were striking. The government was paralyzed. Investors fled the pound. The currency was in freefall. Britain, the victor of World War II, had to go to the IMF. They had to ask for a $3.9 billion loan, the largest loan in IMF history at the time. The humiliated negotiators sat in Washington and accepted the terms: austerity, cuts to public spending, selling off state industries. The U.S. Treasury Secretary watched with satisfaction. The lesson was complete. You cannot project power if you are broke. You cannot have an independent foreign policy if your debt is owned by foreigners. Britain had tried to defy the laws of financial gravity for 50 years. They thought that because they were Great Britain, the math didn't apply to them. They thought their history would pay the bills. They were wrong. And now, let's look at the numbers for the United States. Open your eyes. Look at the trajectory of the US dollar today. It mirrors the British pound from 1914 to 1945 perfectly. The parallels are not just similar. They are identical. Signal number 1. The twin deficits. Just like Britain in 1900, America runs a massive trade deficit and a massive budget deficit. America consumes, it does not produce. It relies on the rest of the world to buy its debt to keep the lights on. For decades, China and Japan bought U.S. treasuries. They were the modern equivalent of the British colonies. Sending goods, getting paper in return, but that is stopping. China is dumping U.S. debt. Japan is struggling to maintain its own currency. Who buys the debt now? The Federal Reserve. America is lending money to itself. That is the definition of a Ponzi scheme. Signal number 2, the weaponization of currency. Remember how the U.S. threatened to crash the pound during Suez? The U.S. has done the same thing with the dollar by freezing Russian assets, by sanctioning Iran. Washington used the dollar as a weapon of war. This works. Once. But it sends a signal to every other nation on earth. Your money is not safe if you disobey. So, what are they doing? They are building an alternative. BRICS, gold, Bitcoin. Central banks are buying gold at the fastest rate since 1967. They are preparing for a post-dollar world. They are doing exactly what the U.S. did to Britain in the 1920s, accumulating hard assets while the empire accumulates paper promises. Signal number 3. The interest trap. This is the math that kills empires. Right now, the interest payments on the U.S. national debt have exceeded the defense budget. Read that again. America spends more paying off the bondholders than it spends on the Army, Navy, and Air Force combined. This is the tipping point. This is the moment of no return. When service on the debt consumes the tax revenue, you have two choices: default or hyperinflation. There is no third door. Britain chose inflation, then austerity. What will America choose? The U.S. is approaching its Suez Moment. Maybe it happens in the Taiwan Strait. Maybe it happens in a bond auction that no one shows up to. But the bluff will be called. The world will realize that the emperor has no clothes. Only 35 trillion in IOUs. The collapse of the British Empire wasn't a tragedy. It was an accounting inevitability. They spent more than they earned. They leveraged their past to pay for their present. They sacrificed their industrial engine on the altar of finance. And when the bill came due, they were shocked. Most people watching this video think the status quo lasts forever. They think the dollar is money. They think their 401k is safe. They are sleepwalking. Just like the British aristocracy dancing in 1913, unaware that their world was about to vanish. History is a circle. The hubris remains the same. The denial remains the same, only the flags change. We are living through the end of a long debt cycle. The transition from the American century to whatever comes next will be turbulent. It will be violent. And it will destroy the wealth of anyone holding the old currency. The British saver who held pounds in 1914 lost 90% of his purchasing power by 1970. 90%. Wiped out by inflation and devaluation. Don't let that be you. Do not trust the official narrative. Do not trust the CPI numbers. Do not trust the politicians telling you the fundamentals are strong. Trust the balance sheet. The balance sheet is screaming insolvency. If you want to understand how to protect yourself, if you want to know which assets survived the death of an empire, subscribe. I don't cover politics. I cover the flow of capital. And right now, the capital is running for the exits. Be prepared, because history doesn't repeat itself. But it rhymes. And the rhyme is ending.